perfectly smooth surface so that you could clearly see right through it to the stars and the moon, but that this served to filter out ultraviolet rays, harmful ultraviolet rays, and also served to create a greenhouse effect on the whole surface of the earth, creating an even temperature where you did not have windstorms, you did not have areas that were colder than others, but you rather had a uniform temperature. It is interesting that in Siberia or in the South Pole regions, you can dig down and find tropical plants. Now, do you have an explanation for how you could have tropical vegetation at the North and South Pole regions? Well, this would give the only explanation that I have ever heard that makes any sense to me. And that is that at one point, that is at the creative time, God had a thin layer of water that was perfectly suspended up in the atmosphere to create a protective bubble around this earth.
In verse 14 it says, "Then God said, let there be light in the expanse of the heavens." So it says that he put the sun, the moon, and the stars in the expanse between the waters.
So what I was saying earlier is that what we had is two uses of that word firmament in the creative days. And some have said that the word firmament can also mean that area beyond the canopy. And I think that probably is a double use of that word. So that idea is space. And it is either space outside the bubble or space inside the bubble. Both times it's translated firmament. So here's what I would suggest to you. I think this is the best explanation for why we have vegetation then. And it also probably contributed to the reason that people lived hundreds of years instead of decades that we have today. That what we've been bombarded with damaging rays from outer space, especially from the sun, that has damaged the genetic makeup of people. And I would suggest that that probably is one of the reasons that God brought this canopy down. He was shortening the lifespan of man.
It says, God made let there be firmament in the midst of the waters, and let them divide the waters from the waters.
Mm-hmm.
Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And so the evening and the morning were the second day, which would mean that if you could have your thin water canopy, but at the end of the second day, all you had was a big ball of water.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there are different ways that people have explained that, and I don't know what the last word actually is on it, but I would just say that there's still a lot of people that hold to that canopy explanation. And yeah, so we don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want you to know that that is one of the explanations that's given. All right, now we move to the second thing, and that is the fall of man. The fall of man. The second major thing that happened. And the fall of man is in the third chapter of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3. So the world today is not the original way that God made it. Prior to the fall and the curse placed on this world, animals and plants had different natures than they do now. There doesn't seem to be any death before the fall. Man was not created with the sin nature. He acquires that capacity and desire to sin at the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. That sin nature has been then inherited in successive generations ever since. This is the warning that God gave to Adam. On the day that you eat of that tree, dying you shall die. There was something very serious that died on the day that Adam and Eve partook of that fruit. There was something that changed in their nature, and suddenly they had a bent toward evil. Now, across the page is blank in your notes, and it's a place if you want to jot some things down, just to say that in the fall you had the tempter, and the tempter is Satan in the form of a snake. It's interesting that Satan is referred to again as that serpent in Revelation 12:7, that says, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was their place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, what he is talking about here is that there were angels. Initially, they were good angels, but they followed Satan, and they became the demons, and they were cast out with Satan. And that is what is referred back to here in Revelation 12:7 and through 9. And then in Revelation 20, verse 1, it says, I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. And what is being referred to again is Satan still has that title of the old serpent from the Garden of Eden. Who was tempted? Who was deceived? Actually, it was both of them are tempted, but Eve was the one who was deceived. Don't look at my notes, just listen. Okay, so they're both tempted. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14 says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into the transgression. So in other words, when Adam took a bite of the apple, or whatever it was, he did it with his eyes wide open. He knew exactly what he was doing. She was deceived. He wasn't deceived. He knew exactly what he was doing. Now, why in the world do you think he did that? She must have been beautiful. I don't know what it was. But he fell into sin without being Satan didn't deceive him. The temptation itself. She saw that fruit, and she saw that it had physical practicality. That is, it was good for food. Physical practicality. It was beautiful to look at. It had aesthetic beauty, and had the potential of making her to be a person in the know. God knows that on the day you eat of this, you will be like God, knowing good from evil. And so it seemed like this was an educational leap. This was a leap in knowledge. And so the temptation appealed to the intellect. It appealed to the aesthetics and the beauty. It appealed also to its practicality, the practicality of it. Why? It's just the practical thing to do. And you know, Satan tempts us in those same ways today. And he will tempt you to do something which is against the will of God, but you say, but it's cheaper for us to live together before we're married. And God says no. And he will say, you know, there's great aesthetic beauty in this thing. Or he will say that there is that you will be more in the know and the intellectual side of it. But whenever Satan is tempting us, I've discovered that he only tempts us with age-appropriate temptations. You notice that? And as you get older, you move through the stages of life, the temptations change. And they become different, depending upon where you're at in life. We must learn from the pattern that was established there in Genesis and the ways of Satan, because he's going to try to get at you also. There are some motifs that run through the temptation, the fall of man. There's the motif of death. On the day that you eat it, you will die. And it's interesting that Christ tasted death for all of us. There's the motif of toil, that you will toil in the soil. And you're going to have to work hard to eke out a living, Adam. And we find in the New Testament that Christ finished the work that the Father gave him to do. We find the theme of sweat. By the sweat of your brow, you will be able to eke out that living. And we find that Christ sweat great drops of blood. God said that the ground would produce thorns and thistles, and that they would be a problem to you. And Christ wore a crown of thorns. There was a tree involved with a fruit on it that brought death, spiritual death. And then Jesus was hung on a tree, on wood that came from a tree, until he was dead. And we find that there is a struggle. The writer of Hebrews tells us, for you have not yet struggled to the point of shedding blood in your struggle against sin. There was the struggle that Adam would then have in his life. And then there's the promise in Genesis 3:15 that there would be the seed of the woman. And that seed of the woman was actually Christ. Until then, Adam's seed, the first Adam, all died. But in Christ, all believers are made alive. And so there are those motifs that run through this temptation story. We can make copies of that. I'm going to move on. Okay, we're going to go to the flood, Genesis 6 through 9. And in this section, we are moving into the third event. And in this one, we find some very interesting things that take place. All right, some themes that run through the flood, and I have printed these in your notes, are these: that God hates sin, and he is the sovereign judge of all sinners. God has given grace toward those who will seek him. He's given grace toward those who will seek him. What's the third thing? Okay. God used the flood to start over with a new creation. There are parallels in the flood narrative to the creation narrative. The dry land appeared in the creation narrative, and it appears here again. And man was to be fruitful and replenish the earth, and that same command that was given to Adam and Eve was then repeated to Noah after the flood. So it's kind of interesting parallels that exist there. God warned the world of future judgment by destroying that generation. Man cannot keep going on and on with sinful practices. God will step in. He is the judge, and he will put an end to it. God established a new covenant with his people and at the close of the flood. And the covenant was in what chapters? Anybody know? Chapter 9, 8 and 9. You'll see references to it. What about the need for the flood? This is not in your notes. The need for the flood. Would you open your Bible up to the 6th chapter of Genesis? What is the need for the flood? When mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were beautiful, and they